Okay, real quick, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, let me start this. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noah Dimas, and today I will be presenting to you all on my senior thesis research titled Secular or Religious, the Makings of a Good Death. And so, let me see here. So to run everyone through a quick outline of my presentation, I'm going to give a brief introduction on the background of my topic. I'm going to state my thesis. I'm going to discuss the rhetorical posturing that surrounds my topic, specifically to give a really quick share. It is on the ideas behind euthanasia and assisted suicide at end-of-life care. And so we're going to bridge into changes that are going to come with assisted suicide and euthanasia in the institution of medicine, as well as greater potential for abuse, physicians being put in the role of secular priests, and then bring about a little bit of a conclusion. And so to give a brief introduction, in the United States, currently California, Oregon, and Colorado lead as proponents of physician-assisted suicide. My PowerPoint here is talking about voluntary euthanasia. That is not currently the case in the United States. No state currently has voluntary euthanasia. However, within the world, Canada, Belgium, and the Netherlands do lead as proponents of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And so the both of them, voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, are both held as a positively affirmed right to all patients whenever a government agency or healthcare systems have decided to legalize and legitimize these as uses of end-of-life care. And so my research discussion has been based around the question of are proponents right in their assertions? And so my thesis in brief is that the legalization and legitimization of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide undermines traditional understandings of the physician-patient relationship, puts the sick, elderly, and infirm at greater risk from abuse from physicians, and forces physicians into the role of a spiritual advisor when many are not equipped for such responsibilities. And so to discuss a little bit of the rhetorical posturing that surrounds my topic, there is a very strong usage of rhetoric throughout the entire discussion of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. For example, there is one of the most eponymous discussions that seems to be a good death. And so this idea of a good death is stated usually around this discussion in the ways that a good death is a death that somebody chooses for themselves. A good death is one that somebody chooses whenever they so desire to, and it is one filled without pain and without suffering. However, I present the idea that this notion of a good death is truly a tricky subject in the way that what can be a good death for somebody can be a bad death for another. It is entirely subjective in its usages and pluralistic in its meaning. For example, I could choose a good death that is one at home with family, whereas another person can choose a good death to be one in a medical facility receiving euthanasia. And furthermore, there's this other idea that's kind of tied to a good death, such as death with dignity. It's very similar in nature to this idea of a good death in that is it very pluralistic in meaning. It has very little basis in a solid definition. For example, hospice. Hospice care can be very dignified in its usages. However, dying at home can also be dignified if I choose to not receive medical care and choose instead to die at home with family under their care. And going on further, another strong piece of rhetoric that's often thrown around is this notion of autonomy. And autonomy is often misrepresented within this discussion of euthanasia and assisted suicide, in that autonomy in that usage tends to misrepresent a principle of medicine as a right. And this is the idea that autonomy states within medical ethics that a person has the right to be able to say what they do and do not want to have done onto themselves. However, it is not an affirmative right in the ways that a patient should not be able to demand something out of a physician. And this is backed by the idea that medical treatments are cooperative. No medical treatment can ever be a demand. As such, you cannot force medical professionals to provide something if they must also agree to the cooperation of the treatment. And so this idea of autonomy is often the basis of all the laws and regulation that is allowed for euthanasia and assisted suicide throughout governmental agencies. And so another piece of rhetoric that's often being thrown around in this discussion is medical assistance in dying. Again, it's another misleading and entirely vague notion, because what qualifies as medical assistance? Whereas somebody could receive hospice care or palliative care in their dying days, that could be medical assistance in dying. Yet proponents tend to group this into the idea that euthanasia and assisted suicide are medical assistance in dying, whenever they may or may not be under proper definition. And so going forward with these ideas, with the current situation surrounding current legal status of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, I propose the idea that there will be great changes in the institution of medicine, because with the legalization and legitimization of these, there comes a radical shift in what medicine is and what it can be used for. Traditionally, we understand medicine to be based on the treatment of illness. This idea that you visit a physician, you visit medical facilities to be treated of illnesses or to be made whole, as the word healing is based in. And so euthanasia and assisted suicide will change this core value of medicine, because now no longer will a physician be fully occupied with healing or with curing illness of a patient, but they will also now have to occupied of when might this person benefit from euthanasia or assisted suicide. And so medicine will then take on new core values as an institution and can no longer present itself solely as an institution focused on healing alone. And so further on with this idea, there is a greater potential for abuse that arises with the legalization and legitimization of physician-assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia, in these ideas that with these being placed into medical institutions, no longer will physicians just be concerned with the patients at hand, because now we are going to give greater opportunity for abuse of at-risk populations, specifically the elderly, the infirm, and the dying, because they can be preyed upon with the marketings of euthanasia and assisted suicide. And these ideas, I've come to the conclusions that it would be a much easier opportunity to make space in healthcare systems if physicians can offer euthanasia and assisted suicide to these at-risk populations, because these people take up spaces in beds. These people take up spaces in intensive care units. These people take up places in hospice. And so it would be a much easier way to get these spaces open again. And this leads to potential abuse. And furthermore, with the implementation of these procedures of euthanasia and assisted suicide, there is going to be a greater opportunity to harvest well-functioning organs in these at-risk populations. No longer are physicians just going to be concerned with the healing, but they also have the other good things in mind of opening up their facilities to more patients, or acquiring organs for those who are on the recipients list. But again, it raises strong concerns. Are these going to be extended to abuse their powers? Are physicians going to be concerned about these things, no longer just about healing the person, but also making space for the next person? And so furthermore, with this idea of legitimization and legalization of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, I propose the idea that physicians are now going to be placed into the role of a death counselor. No longer are physicians just going to be concerned about presenting the facts of a diagnosis or a prognosis. Now physicians are also going to have to take on a sort of death counselor role. They're going to have to help make decisions about when the patient is ready to die, these questions often are based in spiritual ideas of perhaps what do I need to do to get ready for the next life? What am I going to do with my family? All of these kinds of questions are going to arise that many physicians are not qualified nor may want to answer. And so, under the scenario, these physicians take on a role of a sort of secular priest and often are going to have to take on these roles that they're not meant to have. And so, with this idea, it kind of sparked a little bit of a deeper research that I wish to follow into. That I took a look back. I take a look back in time at the Roman Catholic Church and specifically the Ars Moriendi. And so, for those unfamiliar, the Ars Moriendi is a medieval text that allowed for a unified form of prayer and actions for the dying and those caring for the dying. These actions included lots of prayers, lots of ways that you need to treat the dying, the things that you need to do in order to get the dying ready for the next life. All of these things were written out and given to the Catholic faithful. And because of this idea, looking back on this in medieval times, I was able to realize that the faithful understood that the secular world only had so much to offer them. And so whenever it became necessary, they stopped going to the secular world for their questions and instead started to talk to their spiritual council. In this context, that was their local priest, their local bishop, and really tried to prepare themselves to experience the next world because of the fact that they knew death was inevitable and they had to get themselves ready for what else was coming after. And so I propose the idea that proponents ought to recognize that this killing of patients through voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide opens up the door to multiple questions, these questions of faith, these questions of spirituality, these questions of religion, end of life decisions. These are questions that physicians cannot answer. And so, in summary, my research has been focused on this idea that legalization and legitimization of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide is problematic at best and morally dangerous at worst. Whenever government agencies or medical institutions open up this door to voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, it's a very problematic idea in the ways that now we are no longer treating medicine as a healing institution. Now physicians, whenever they go through medical school, are going to have to receive some sort of counseling training, some sort of spiritual guidance training in the ways of how to guide their patients through these stages of death. And this is not something that I have seen proponents really discussing in my research and in the current discussion surrounding these ideas. And so I put forward then that medicine is then going to continue to change dramatically in standards of care as an institution. And so, again, this idea that physicians are not going to be solely concerned with the patient, but are also going to have to think about what best ways can they allocate resources, potentially by allowing a patient to receive euthanasia or assisted suicide. And so I continue to say that this legalization and legitimization will continue to put at-risk populations even more at risk for abuse. And so I just generally propose through my conclusions that greater discussions of these repercussions that I pose ought to take place before any further laws are enacted, really to reflect on the ethical and moral implications surrounding these ideas. Again, it seems like a lot of proponents, and specifically the governmental agencies and lawmakers who have put forward these ideas, do not seem to realize the repercussions within morality and ethics that are going to take place once they enact these laws. Throughout all of my research, most of the laws that I've read personally always state that this is an affirmative thing, and this legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide ought to be encouraged and actively enforced within the medical institutions. And again, it seems there's nowhere that there's this discussion of the potential repercussions and changes in medicine are taking place. And so I really propose that as a sort of take-home message, we must open the door to this discussion. We must open ourselves up to answering these questions that, yes, while they may be difficult, are absolutely necessary before any further steps are taken, because these are really very great and very troublesome questions that have yet to be answered properly. So that is my presentation, and I open up the door to any questions.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Cherry, would you like to step in now? And then anybody else who has questions, you can unmute and ask or put them in the chat box.
Noah, thank you very much. Really interesting presentation. As I mentioned before, one of the great joys of being a professor is to have wonderful students, because they challenge you and they push you to really rethink things. And I've had a wonderful time in the last year working with you on this project. So my question for you is similar to the previous question, the question I asked Megan, but let me preface it in kind of a different way. As you and I were talking all year, one of the part of our conversation turned on conversations that I was having with some folks in Canada, because I happen to know people in Canada who organize the euthanasia procedures for certain parts of their healthcare system. And this one particular individual who's a bioethicist like I am is actually carried out the killing of, or the euthanizing, however what language one wants to use, of more than 20 patients. And she was sort of this enthusiastic supporter. It was very interesting to me to talk with her about it, and in some ways very surprising what she had to say. So for you, the question is what did you find the most interesting or the most surprising as you went through your research? I mean, what struck you? What drew you out? What did you find just really fascinating in dealing with the project?
To me, what has been most fascinating throughout this research process has been really the discovery that so many governmental agencies, so many individuals in advocacy groups present euthanasia and assisted suicide as something to be entirely positive. This was not something that I was honestly expecting to find throughout my research. Growing up in a Catholic background and being taught in a Catholic morality, that was something that I always understood to be wholly negative and wholly evil. And so for me to find governmental agencies and advocacy groups who are advocating very intently for these changes in the medical institution, I find it to be extremely shocking and very eye-opening, and honestly one of the reasons why I decided to get into this research was because I really wanted to understand the other side's point of view in trying to discover why did they affirm this so tightly and hold this up as a strong right whenever I had never seen it as such.
Any other questions for Noah?
I actually had a question.
Yes, of course.
I wanted to know about kind of, with you saying that there is a presentation of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide as a positive thing, I was curious about the idea of like depression as a complication of illnesses and chronic illnesses and terminal illnesses. And if you have any comments on whether the legalization and legitimization might cause physicians to be put in a hard place of making the decision for someone who's kind of in an altered state of mind. And additionally, do you think that physicians' own beliefs could affect those decisions?
Okay, so if I understood your question correctly, you're asking about complications surrounding mental illnesses, perhaps specifically depression and things of that nature. And throughout my research, I have not personally focused on questions of that. That has been a little bit outside of my current research. However, under my understandings as I currently know them, the questions surrounding altered states of mind and decision-making in those cases seems to really be a even more tricky topic than the one that I have been presented with. Um, I generally think that those decision makings must be made with much greater care than any current system has. Current systems that have assisted suicide or euthanasia in place tend to say that a psychiatric diagnosis is not required in order to be of sound mind. And if any system does have that in their writing, it is up to the primary care physician to make that decision whether or not they need any sort of psychiatric uh, evaluation prior to the administering of euthanasia or assisted suicide. And so, from my own personal perspective, I see it as that is another step that must be taken because, again, it complicates the situation even greater. And in those ways, I find it to be even more problematic because there is little in place to truly make sure that the patients who may be disturbed mentally in any way are instead ought to be given that care first before any other decisions may be made. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a absolutely great way to phrase it, and that answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
Wonderful. And if I saw correctly, there are some questions in the chat.
Yes, from Angel. Did you find any particularly interesting approaches to physician-assisted suicide coming from different cultures or certain religions?
Mm-hmm. From my personal perspectives, I only approach this from the Roman Catholic Judeo-Christian tradition. As of right now, I do not have enough background to approach this discussion from other cultures or other religions. That would be something that I would have to spend a lot more time than the time that I was allotted to research. However, from my current research, I was able to come very strongly at this from a, like I said, Judeo-Christian Roman Catholic tradition. And so I found this to be very much at odds with what the secular world has decided, especially with governmental agencies, that the Judeo-Christian tradition, specifically Roman Catholics, are very much against this idea of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide in the ways that it severs one's relationship to God, taking their own life, destroys that relationship, and rejects the gift of life. And so that, in contrast with secular society, was a very challenging thing to approach because secular society has very little qualms with the ideas that I can take my own life. And so that was one of the more challenging and honestly very interesting approaches that I had to give to this discussion.
Okay, thanks. And there is one more question, and I think we have time, and this is from Dr. Prawl. Great presentation, Noah. In countries or states that have approved forms of voluntary euthanasia, have these places put in any forms of protection or regulation to try to prevent abuse of vulnerable populations?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question. And in my own research, the countries and states that have been able to implement these procedures in their healthcare systems, they do not currently have any sorts of protections for vulnerable populations. The only requirements that these governments have put in place is that the primary care physician must give the okay that the patient is of sound mind and that the patient is terminal within a certain time window. That is the only requirements that are truly required to receive these euthanasia or assisted suicide. And so currently I don't see any protections properly. And so again, this is somewhat of a troublesome and this is a very troublesome thing for me because like I said, I really desire there to be something in place because we must have discussions surrounding these.
Okay, thank you very much, Noah. We pushed it to the last second so you could answer those really interesting questions, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Cherry. See you soon, maybe. I don't know when, but we're going to move on next to the presentation by